Thank you very much. Allow me to welcome Edward Anderson. Please welcome Edward. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what really focusing on urbanization and climate risks really mean to you, and then we dive into whatever we're discussing on future of jobs and gig economy, and focusing on Resilience Academy.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. I have been in Tanzania for 6 years now, but in the last couple of years, I'm focusing regionally across Africa on the use of disruptive technologies for resilience, particularly urban resilience. And the reason is that, Africa is one of the fastest urbanizing continents in the world, but it's urbanizing in a very informal and unplanned way. And so if we're going to prevent these cities growing into mega slums, but rather being productive mega cities, we need to urgently sort of accelerate the transition to digital and local. We need local human capital to be part of that digital production model of surveys and services and analytics, working with AI and machine learning tools that are out there. So my focus on technologies is really about local devices, open standards, open data, and low complexity approaches that can accelerate this sort of transition to digital and local. So today I'm quite pleased to talk about micro-tasking and micro-learning platforms as a subset of the gig economy, and what I think the role of the public sector can be in kind of catalyzing markets that are both public and private for people who do digital tasks locally. So I think we can jump into the presentation. If you guys can manage that for me, thank you very much. Conscious of the time, I don't want to dwell too long. I think the video introduced a little bit the micro-tasking. That was from Zanzibar, and that was work that was actually done in September and October. So what I'd like to sort of explain a little bit is show you what it looks like and give you a flavor of 7 different pilot projects that the World Bank has run on 9 different micro-tasking platforms in African cities in the last 3 or 4 months. Partly as a response to COVID, but something we've been wanting to do for a long time. So first slide, please. So this sort of illustrates the steps of what micro-tasking is all about. It's really very simple, small activities that can be done either as a sitting task at your desk, on your device, tablet, laptop, or phone, or as a field data collection task locally within your neighborhood. So we don't really have to travel around. We don't have to fly in experts. We can farm these tasks to people who are in those cities or in those neighborhoods. And these tasks can be as simple as one tap of your finger on the screen to maybe a few actions to analyze or extract features or label or translate things. Next slide, please. So this is just to sort of show you the subset or family of micro-tasks that are quite common with this online work, collecting geodata, doing surveys online, reacting to audio or written materials like translating it or just saying if it feels happy or sad. So most of this is driven by the sort of the advertising, research, and survey industry in the private sector. But for the public sector, I think there's a huge untapped potential of tasks that could be found out that we're going to discuss now. Next slide, please. So this is the World Bank's pilots that I was managing recently. The idea here was to spend as little money and as little time as necessary to really validate a lot of the technical workflow aspects, but not yet at the scale where we can look at the sort of financial benefits in terms of income opportunity, in terms of learning opportunity for people involved. So we still want to go there. But what we're really doing is farming out public sector tasks that governments would have paid for anyway through a micro-tasking workflow. So we had slightly over 2.8 million tasks that were accomplished over the last 3 months. Next slide, please. So the first pilot was an activity in Kenya, almost 800 people involved in 161,000 tasks. And this was really quite simple, tapping pictures on your phone to help validate a global data set called the World Settlement Footprint. So World Settlement Footprint is really important for urban planning and for African policymakers because it's using satellite data and AI to automatically detect change of the built environment. How many new buildings, how dense are those buildings? Are they sitting sprawling or are they densifying? Is construction happening in hazardous land like floodplains or slopes, and so on. But it needs to be ground truth, right? It needs to have some human intervention to validate the data set. And usually what the companies that do to develop this is they hire Google to essentially do this task, and that might be farmed out anywhere in the world, or they might actually, even worse, hire a specific firm to go and validate a subsample. So German Aerospace Corporation, DLR, wanted 1 million data points of validation, and we said, well, let's try to source those validation activities from local Africans in the cities of note. And so you see some images of what that looks like. In the simplest form is confirming if there's a building or not in the tile that you're looking at. Next slide, please. And you see here what that product looks like in the case of Dar es Salaam. This is the World Settlement Footprint Dar es Salaam, showing you the age of buildings over time, which is really useful to see how the city has grown, how it's expanded. Historically, this product has been done once every 5 years. But parts of Dar es Salaam are growing at 20%, so they're doubling in 4 years in the outskirts. So what we really wanted to do is, can we automate this and have it update every 3 months, right? And to do that, we need a lot of human validation of the AI. So it's a human-machine co-production, if you like. Next slide, please. Also in Kenya, this was an example of actually field tasks, going out into your neighborhood and collecting data for COVID hotspot modeling. So we wanted to know in informal neighborhoods, where are the water points, the public toilets, the markets, the waste sites, bus stops, areas where people congregate that you would want to have public health information, you know, sanitizer available, or you might want to monitor and enforce hygiene activities, or you might even want to lock down those areas depending on your response to the pandemic. So obviously in informal settlements, authorities really struggle. They don't have this data, but local communities, they know where their water point is, where their toilets are. So this is just a way to very quickly digitize that without having to send anybody into those communities from abroad. It was quite a limited task, 161 people. Takes a bit more time to collect each water point. Next slide, please. And it's part of this sort of mobile open data kit mapping that we've been doing for a while, but breaking it down and farming it out through microtasking allows you to collect this kind of information quite efficiently, quite cheaply. And you also find some of the really talented microtaskers who can be quite productive. Next slide, please. So then we have, back to Zanzibar, that was featured in the video, but not particularly well explained, is using Street View imagery and a platform called Mapillary, I think. You can't quite see it on the screen. And here we're extracting different urban features for urban upgrading or cultural heritage preservation. So in the example, you see a street lamp that is being tagged from the Street View picture rather than from the aerial picture. And you can label that and put that also in the data set. Next slide, please. And you see here the information going on to OpenStreetMap. So really enriching the hyper-local data in these fast-changing informal communities in a very cost-effective way. Next slide, please. The other pilot from Tanzania, we had a few, and this was embedded into the Resilience Academy Vanessa mentioned. So mostly university students or ex-students that recently graduated but were unemployed participated in also validating the World Settlement Footprint, but in this case using Street View imagery as well to get building heights. So we also need not only to validate the sort of flat product of are there buildings or not derived by satellite. But in major urban centers, we want to know how high these buildings are to collect floor space index, which is the ratio of the number of floors to the open ground. Next slide, please. And you can see here that it's also quite a simple task of tapping on each individual floor and validating what's the correct answer is based on taking, I think in this case it was 8 taskers' answers to the problem and inferring what was correct from the distribution of those 8 taskers and what they were saying. Next task. So this was a little bit more sophisticated than just is there a building or not, but it was actually counting buildings, still pretty simple, still pretty quick. You can do thousands of these tasks, but you don't want to do it for 8 hours a day. So you have to manage the workflow so it's not too mind-numbing. Next one, please. And you see an example on the next slide of that 3D product that is also for all the major cities in Africa, ideally also updated every 3 months, helping us really plan, design, and upgrade these cities in a more sort of formalized way. Next, please. Another one that I'm really quite interested in is the use of drone imagery. So we see this revolution in drone surveys, but we're only just sort of at the tip of the iceberg, as it were, of what can we extract from this very high resolution imagery. So in Mali, taskers were analyzing images for solid waste dumps. Next slide, please. And you should see here in the photos when you zoom in, the kind of example of this very high resolution image that you can then begin to tag areas where trash has been dumped. This was something that we had done last year in Dar es Salaam using drone imagery, but not pushing it through a micro-tasking platform. So in this way, we're able to get better metrics in terms of how to distribute it, source it, and finance it much more efficiently. Next, please. And I think the final pilot I just want to mention is coming back to Tanzania. This is actually students from Sokoine University that are involved in tree surveys and tree counting. This is an important part of erosion prevention in Dar es Salaam. We want to reforest big parts of the mid-basin and upper basin of the Mzimbazi River for flood prevention, but we need to sort of know how many trees there are, what kind of trees, and monitor their health over time. One of the things to look at is the canopy cover. So canopy is digitizing the crown of each tree, and that's what you see in the top image. It's a more involved task. It's difficult to do on your phone, but you can still do it over an internet connection on a laptop or desktop. And this is really quite useful, not just for the flood control project that would need this data anyway, but for heat stress, for greening, for parks, all sorts of urban analytics. Next slide, please. So to sort of wrap it up, I mean, there's a few key messages. I'm excited about the age of artificial intelligence because I really do think that the computers aren't that intelligent. There's a lot of human validation, ground control required. The challenge is how do we really make that feedback loop? How do we sort of ethically outsource those tasks to the communities that are benefiting from the services? So people are not only participating directly in a sort of digital production chain of their digital future, but they're also getting awareness of what these services are, what these data sets are, and how it might affect them. So I think there's some area of learning and skilling in terms of using the platforms and being able to earn income from a range of sitting and field tasks. But there's also, I think, quite a lot of awareness that can be generated about the value of these data sets and how they're being used that is also professionally useful. Next slide, please. So I believe that's the summary of the talk. And I think the key point I really want to make is I think public sector, governments, World Bank are behind the private sector in the use of micro-working platforms, but they generate such a large portion of the potential demand for tasks that they could be catalytic in really creating local markets and transitioning a lot of local people onto these platforms that could then go on and earn other opportunities through private gigs. So in the case of Kenya, we did partner with one platform by Google called TaskMate, And the World Bank was, I think, half of the tasks by volume of tasks and maybe a quarter by value. We had very simple tasks. But then you had various public sector and private sector companies, including Google itself, also feeding tasks into the platform. So the size of this economy is much, much bigger, and I think CK alluded to a lot of those numbers. But what's not clear to me is how government contracts can be restructured so that a large portion of the procurement for digital works and surveys is farmed out to local gig economy sources rather than foreign companies. And that's really my hope and opportunity that I see in the coming 12 to 24 months, that we can lobby to have a lot more of this work sort of locally sourced rather than internationally procured. Thank you.